The first week, after humanity stopped attending council sessions, nothing happened. The second week, a minor clerk in the Tessari administrative office sent a routine inquiry to the human embassy on Aethys Prime, asking if Ambassador Price intended to submit his quarterly scheduling form. The message bounced back as undeliverable. The clerk noted it in the system and moved on. That was the full extent of the council's concern. High Arbiter Vorun Thes was briefed about the human absence during a cabinet meeting 1 month later, only because the agenda had a gap and someone thought to mention it. Vorun Thes was an old being, older than most structures on Aethys Prime, and he had seen species come and go from the council the way leaves fall from trees. He listened to the briefing with half-closed eyes and said that this was not unusual. Species of lesser significance often retreated into irrelevance when they realized they could not compete at the galactic level. He said it was natural. He said it was expected. He said the council should not waste resources following up. The cabinet agreed without discussion, and the matter was closed. War Marshal Dren Okari of the Rakon Dominion heard about the human departure during a military review 3 weeks after that. His staff officer mentioned it as a footnote in a sector status update. Dren laughed. He told the room that humanity had likely collapsed into civil war, as young species always did when they overextended themselves. He said he had studied human history once, and found it to be nothing but a long record of them fighting each other over land, resources, and ideas. He said the galaxy was better off without their noise. His officers laughed with him, and the briefing moved on to matters they considered important. No ship was sent to check on the humans. No ambassador was dispatched. No council observer was assigned to verify what had happened. Humanity had been a background presence for 60 years, and their disappearance was treated with the same disinterest that their presence had always received. This was the gap that Danny Holt had built his entire plan around. While the council carried on with its debates and power struggles, Captain Laura Bishop stood on the command deck of the Pale Morning, a deep space carrier that had been retrofitted in secret over 4 years specifically for this operation. Laura was a tall woman with short red hair and a calm voice that could carry across a flight deck without ever rising above a conversational tone. She had spent her entire career in deep space logistics, moving people and materials across distances that most species found uncomfortable to think about. Now she was coordinating the largest covert population transfer in human history. The numbers were staggering. 42 colony worlds, 217 deep space stations, research outposts, mining platforms, communication relays, agricultural habitats, orbital construction yards, and people. Over 9 billion civilians, all of whom had to be moved behind the Veil Line without the Council detecting a single transport. The Veil Line was humanity's greatest secret. For 15 years, while the Council had ignored human space as an irrelevant backwater, human engineers had been constructing a boundary. It was not a wall or a shield in the traditional sense. It was a network of installations that generated sensor-dampening fields and gravitational corridor disruptions across a vast stretch of space. Anything on the Council's side of the line would see only static and empty void where human territory used to be. The technology was based on principles that the Council's own scientists had published and then dismissed as impractical decades ago. Humanity had read those papers very carefully. The outermost colonies went first, the ones closest to Council-monitored space. Civilian transports moved along routes that human scouts had charted through regions no Council species had ever bothered to explore, because the Council considered them empty and worthless. Each wave was followed by a cleanup team that dismantled every structure, removed every satellite, collected every piece of orbital debris. They left nothing behind, not a foundation, not a signal beacon, not a scratch on the ground. Lieutenant Megan Cole oversaw the forward outpost dismantling from aboard the Steadfast Horizon. Megan was sharp in every sense of the word. She had a quick tongue, a quicker mind, and absolutely no patience for wasted time. She had spent 3 years stationed at a border outpost where she had watched Council patrol ships pass through human space without so much as acknowledging the human station they flew past. They treated human territory like an empty hallway they were entitled to walk through. Now she watched her teams pull those stations apart, piece by piece, and load them onto transport carriers. She kept a personal count. By the end of the second month, her teams had dismantled 38 outposts and left behind nothing but clean vacuum. Not once during that entire operation did a Council ship come to investigate. Not once did a Council sensor array ping them with a query. The galaxy simply did not care what happened in the quiet margin. Megan found that she was not angry about this anymore. She had been angry once, years ago, when she had first understood how completely the Council dismissed her species. Now she felt something colder and more useful. She felt focused. On the other side of the operation, Sergeant Nate Greer sat in a listening post that was still embedded in a dead zone near Council space. Nate was a ground forces veteran who had transitioned into intelligence work after a knee injury that he never talked about. He was a patient man, the kind who could sit in a dark room for 12 hours watching data feeds and never lose concentration. His job was to monitor Council communications and feed intelligence back to Earth. What he found almost made him laugh. The Council's military readiness had actually decreased since humanity's departure. The resources the Rokan Dominion had previously allocated to monitoring human space, small as those resources were, had been redistributed to deal with internal disputes. 2 Council species were arguing over a mining corridor. Another was threatening to withdraw from a trade agreement. The Tessari were dealing with a bureaucratic scandal in their shipping administration. The galaxy was busy with itself, and humanity was the last thing on anyone's mind. Nate compiled his reports and sent them through encrypted channels that bounced off relay nodes hidden in asteroid fields the Council had never mapped. His reports all said the same thing in different ways. Nobody was looking. Nobody was coming. The window was wide open. On Earth, in a facility buried deep underground beneath a mountain range that had no official name on any public map, Dr. Penny Marsh watched a sequence of lights turn green on a console that stretched the length of the room. Penny was a small woman with dark curly hair and glasses she did not actually need anymore, but wore out of habit. She had spent 22 years working on Project Longhand, a name that only a few hundred people in the entire human population knew. She had missed birthdays, holidays, and most of her 30s. She had solved problems that the Council's greatest minds had declared unsolvable. She had done it in a basement, with a fraction of the budget that the Council spent on decorating their amphitheater. The last light turned green. Penny stood very still for a moment, feeling the hum of the machinery beneath her feet. Then she picked up a secure communication device and typed a 3-word message to Commander Danny Holt. Longhand is live. Danny received the message aboard a transport ship crossing the Veil Line. He read it once. He deleted it. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply looked out the viewport at the stars ahead, stars that now belonged to a humanity that had finally stopped asking for permission and started building something of its own. Behind him, the Veil Line sealed shut. From the outside, there was nothing to see, just empty space and silence. The kind of silence the Council had always wanted from humanity. They just never realized that when it finally came, it would be the most dangerous sound in the galaxy. It started with small things. A Tessari trade fleet carrying luxury goods between 2 core worlds dropped out of faster-than-light transit in the wrong sector. The navigator ran diagnostics and found that the positioning data the ship had received from the Galactic Navigation Network was off by a fraction of a degree. It was a tiny error, Almost nothing. But at faster-than-light speeds, a fraction of a degree meant arriving 2 star systems away from the intended destination. The fleet recalibrated manually and continued on its way. The captain filed a complaint. Nobody followed up. 3 days later, a Rokon border patrol lost contact with 3 monitoring stations along the edge of what used to be the human frontier. The stations were old automated platforms that had been installed decades ago, and most of the officers assumed they had simply reached the end of their operational life. Replacement orders were submitted through the usual bureaucratic channels, which meant they would arrive in about 6 months. Nobody thought much of it. A week after that, 2 more trade fleets reported navigation errors. Then 4 more. Then a passenger liner carrying 12,000 Valesi citizens arrived at the wrong orbital station and had to be rerouted manually, causing a delay that rippled through the transit schedule of an entire sector. People began to complain, but they complained the way people always complained about infrastructure problems. They blamed the bureaucracy. They blamed underfunding. They blamed each other. Delegate Sierra Cohn did not blame anyone. She sat in her quarters on Aethys Prime and pulled up every report she could find about the navigation network. And what she found made her chest feel tight. The Galactic Navigation Network was the oldest shared system in Council space. It had been built over centuries by dozens of species, each contributing calibration nodes and relay points in their own territories. The system worked because it was interconnected. Every node relied on data from every other node to maintain accuracy across the vast distances of the galaxy. Sierra traced the network map and found what she had feared. A significant cluster of calibration nodes, ones that helped anchor the positioning data for nearly a quarter of the galaxy's trade corridors, were located in space that had once been designated as human territory. Those nodes were gone. Not offline, not damaged, gone. There was nothing at those coordinates anymore, just empty space and silence. She brought her findings to the council the next morning. She stood before the chamber and laid out the data clearly and carefully. She told them that the human departure was not a retreat or a collapse. It was a deliberate and total withdrawal, and it had created a gap in the galactic infrastructure that was growing wider every day. She told them they needed to investigate immediately. High Arbiter Varun Thes listened from his elevated seat at the center of the chamber. When Sura finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her that the Council had maintained the navigation network for thousands of years before humanity even learned to leave its own planet. He said that a few missing nodes in a backwater region could not threaten a system that had served the galaxy since before humans discovered fire. He told her that her concerns were noted, and that the technical division would look into the matter when their schedule permitted. Syrah sat down. She wanted to argue. She wanted to stand up and tell Varun Thes that his arrogance was blinding him to something dangerous. But she had served on the council long enough to know that arguing with the High Arbiter in open session was like arguing with a mountain. You spent all your energy, and the mountain did not move. But the navigation errors did not care about politics. Within 3 weeks, 17 major trade corridors experienced disruptions. Supply chains between council worlds began to break down. A food shipment meant for a Tessari agricultural colony arrived 2 weeks late because the transport fleet had to recalculate its route manually after the automated system sent them in the wrong direction. A medical supply delivery to a Rokon frontier station never arrived at all. The ship carrying it was still missing. Emergency repair teams were sent to install new calibration nodes in the areas where the old ones had disappeared. They reported back with troubling news. The spaces where human colonies and stations had once existed were completely empty. Not abandoned, empty. There were no ruins, no wreckage, no leftover structures, no orbital debris. Every trace of human presence had been removed so thoroughly that it was as if humanity had never been there. The repair teams could not even find anchor points for new nodes, because the gravitational signatures in the region had changed in ways they did not understand. War Marshal Dren Okari stopped laughing. He assembled a reconnaissance fleet of 40 warships and ordered them to enter what had once been human space and find out what had happened. The fleet was fast, well-armed, and crewed by experienced officers. Dren expected them to return within a week with a simple explanation. Perhaps the humans had retreated to a smaller territory. Perhaps they had built a few hidden bases. The Rokon fleet would find them, and the Council would deal with the situation from a position of strength, as it always had. The fleet entered the former human zone and found the same emptiness the repair teams had reported. Bare planetary surfaces where cities had once stood. Clean orbits where stations had once hung. Nothing on any frequency. Nothing on any scanner. The fleet commander, an experienced officer named Tor Vashai, pushed deeper into the zone, following the old star maps that showed where the largest human colonies had been. On the fourth day, they reached the Veil Line. Tor Vashai did not know what it was at first. His sensors simply stopped returning useful data. The screens showed static, then nothing, then readings that contradicted each other. Stars that should have been visible were not there. Gravitational readings fluctuated wildly. The fleet's navigation systems, already unreliable due to the network failures, shut down entirely. Tor ordered a probe launched into the anomaly. The probe entered the boundary, and its signal vanished instantly. He launched a second probe. Same result. He launched a third, with a hardened signal booster rated for the most extreme conditions in known space. It lasted 4 seconds longer than the others, before its signal was swallowed. Tor Vashai was not a man who frightened easily. He had served in 3 border conflicts and commanded ships in regions where the space itself was unstable. But standing on his command deck, staring at a wall of nothing that his instruments could not explain and his weapons could not reach, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt small. 2 of his captains, eager to prove themselves, requested permission to take their ships across the boundary. Tor hesitated, then granted it. The 2 ships moved forward, crossed the edge of the anomaly, and disappeared. Not destroyed, not attacked. They simply stopped existing on every sensor, every communication channel, every tracking system the fleet possessed. They were gone in a way that left no trace and no explanation. Tor recalled the fleet immediately. He turned his ships around and headed back to Council space at maximum speed. He composed his report during the return journey, writing and rewriting it several times because every version sounded impossible. The final report was delivered to the Council chamber by secure courier. It was brief by military standards. It contained the sensor logs, the probe data, and the records of the 2 lost ships. At the end, Tor Vashai had added a single line of personal assessment. He wrote that the humans did not collapse. He wrote that they prepared. Dren Okari read the report in his command office and said nothing for a long time. Then he sent it to the Council without comment. Syrah Cohn read it in the chamber that afternoon. When she finished, she looked up at the rows of delegates around her. The room was completely silent. For the first time since humanity had joined the Council 60 years ago, everyone in the galaxy was thinking about them. But it was too late for thinking. The quiet margin was not quiet anymore. It was sealed, and the galaxy had no idea what was on the other side. On the other side of the Veil Line, the stars looked different. Not because they had changed, but because for the first time in 60 years, human eyes were looking at them without the weight of someone else's judgment pressing down from above. Commander Danny Holt stood on an observation platform high above the surface of New Avalon, the world that Earth's unified command had designated as the administrative center of humanity's rebuilt civilization. The planet had been terraformed over the course of 8 years, using methods the Council had never seen. Where there had once been a barren rock circling an unremarkable star, there was now a world with blue-green oceans, temperate forests, and cities that rose from the ground like they had always belonged there. It was not Earth. Nothing would ever be Earth, but it was home in the way that mattered most, a place built by choice rather than given by accident. Lieutenant Megan Cole walked up beside him. She had traded her shipboard uniform for a lighter field jacket, and her dark hair was tied back loosely. She had spent the last 2 months helping coordinate the final settlement operations on the outer colony worlds, and the work had left her tired but steady. She looked out at the city below, where lights were beginning to come on as evening settled across the valley, and she told Danny that she still could not quite believe it. Danny asked her what part she could not believe. She said all of it. The cities, the infrastructure, the fact that 9 billion people had been moved across open space without a single casualty and without a single detection by the most advanced sensor networks in the galaxy. She said it felt like a dream, the kind where you keep waiting to wake up and find yourself back in the small room you were trying to escape. Danny told her it was not a dream. It was the result of 60 years of patience and 20 years of very deliberate work. And then, he told her, it was time she saw the full picture, because what they had built went far beyond new cities and colony worlds. They traveled together to the deep complex beneath New Avalon's northern mountain range, where Dr. Penny Marsh had established the central hub of Project Longhand. Penny met them at the entrance, wearing the same lab coat she seemed to wear every day, and the same glasses she did not need. She led them through corridors that hummed with energy into a briefing room where Sergeant Nate Greer and Captain Laura Bishop were already waiting. Penny stood at the front of the room and began explaining what humanity had accomplished in the dark, during all those years when the galaxy was not watching. She started with travel. The galactic navigation network that the Council depended on was a shared system, and any species that used it was bound by its limitations, and more importantly, by its visibility. Every ship that moved through the network could be tracked, logged, and monitored. Humanity had been moving through this system for 60 years, which meant the Council had always known exactly where human ships were, and how fast they could go. That was no longer true. Project Longhand's first breakthrough was a new form of faster-than-light travel that did not use the galactic network at all. Human scientists had developed self-contained corridor generation, a system that allowed a ship to create its own transit path between any 2 points in space without relying on external infrastructure. The corridors were temporary, collapsing behind the ship after transit, leaving no trace. A human fleet could move from one end of the galaxy to the other, and no one would know it had traveled at all. Megan leaned forward in her chair. She asked how fast. Penny told her that the new system was roughly 4 times faster than standard galactic transit. Megan sat back and said nothing for a while. The second breakthrough was energy. The Council's economy ran on a network of fuel sources, rare isotopes, and exotic matter that were controlled by a handful of powerful species. Access to these fuels was one of the primary tools the Council used to maintain its authority. If you wanted to keep your worlds powered and your ships running, you played by the Council's rules. Humanity had been dependent on this system like everyone else. Not anymore. Penny explained that her team had developed a distributed energy grid based on zero-point extraction principles. The science had been published by a Tassari researcher over a century ago, and promptly ignored because the Council's energy corporations had no interest in a technology that would make their products worthless. Humanity had taken that forgotten research and spent 2 decades turning it into a working system. Every human world, every station, every ship now generated its own power from the fabric of space itself. They would never need to buy fuel from anyone again. Danny watched Megan's face as she processed this. He could see her doing the math, understanding what it meant. A civilization with independent travel and independent energy was a civilization that could not be controlled through supply lines, trade restrictions, or economic pressure. It was a civilization that owed nothing to anyone. But Penny was not finished. She brought up a display that showed the veil line, not as a simple boundary, but as a three-dimensional structure of incredible complexity. The veil, she explained, was not a sensor screen. It was a spatial alteration field. It did not simply block signals from passing through. It physically changed the geometry of the space it occupied. The region inside the veil existed in a slightly different configuration than the space outside it, which meant that anything trying to cross the boundary without proper calibration would find itself moving in directions it did not intend. Its instruments reading conditions that did not match reality. The two Rokon ships that had crossed the boundary were not destroyed, Penny added. They were lost. They were probably still flying somewhere inside the veil's distortion zone, unable to find their way out, because their navigation systems were designed for normal space, and the space inside the veil was not normal. Penny said her team could retrieve them if the order was given. Danny said, not yet. The most important thing about the veil, Penny continued, was that it was not fixed. It could be expanded or contracted. New sections could be added. Corridors could be opened and closed at will. It was a door, and humanity held the only key. Nate Greer stood up next. He had been monitoring Council communications from hidden relay points ever since the withdrawal, and his report painted a picture that confirmed everything Danny had anticipated. The Council was fracturing. Without the navigation calibration nodes that had run through human space, the galactic network was operating at reduced capacity, and degrading further every month. Trade disputes were escalating between species that had previously cooperated. The Rokon Dominion and the Tessari were exchanging formal threats over a contested resource corridor. 3 minor species had pulled their delegates from Aethys Prime. The Council was spending so much energy managing its own internal crises that it had no capacity left to address the human situation, even if it wanted to. Nate said something that stuck with everyone in the room. He said the Council was not falling apart because humanity attacked it. It was falling apart because humanity had been quietly holding pieces of it together without anyone noticing, and now those pieces were coming loose. Laura Bishop, who had been listening silently from her seat near the back, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What was the plan now? They had left. They had built something extraordinary. They had the technology, the independence, and the security to live entirely apart from the rest of the galaxy. So what came next? Danny stood at the window and looked out at the lights of New Avalon below. He told them that for the first time in human history among the stars, they were not reacting to what someone else decided. They were not scrambling to respond to a threat or begging for a seat at a table that did not want them. They had the power to choose, and what they chose was to wait. Megan asked what they were waiting for. Danny said they were waiting for a knock on the door, because it would come. The Council would eventually realize that it needed humanity more than humanity needed the Council. And when that day arrived, the conversation would be very different from any conversation that had come before. Laura Bishop returned to the pale morning that evening. She stood on the command deck and looked at the long-range display, where the faint light of Council space flickered like a distant candle. She told her bridge crew to hold position just inside the veil line and to keep watching. She said that when the Council came, and they would come, humanity would be ready. But this time, they would not be sitting in the back of the room with their hands folded. This time, they would be the ones deciding who got to speak. 2 years. That was how long it took for the Galactic Council to do what Danny Holt always knew it would do. 2 years of slow unraveling, of systems failing and alliances cracking, and old certainties dissolving like salt in water. 2 years of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy learning what it felt like to be ignored. The navigation network was operating at 40% capacity. Entire sectors had been forced to switch to manual transit calculations, which meant longer travel times, higher costs, and a constant low hum of anxiety among the populations that depended on reliable transport to keep their worlds fed and supplied. 3 minor species had formally withdrawn from the Council, not out of protest, but out of practicality. They could no longer afford the dues when the services the Council provided were breaking down. The Rokon Dominion, never patient under the best of circumstances, had begun expanding unilaterally into disputed territories along its borders. War Marshal Dren Okari argued that the Council's inability to maintain order justified the Dominion taking matters into its own hands. Vurun Thes condemned the expansion in a formal address, but his words carried less weight than they once had. Everyone could see that the High Arbiter's authority was eroding. Sessions that once ran with the precision of clockwork now dissolved into shouting matches that accomplished nothing. Behind closed doors, Vurun Thes sat alone in his chambers and stared at the reports he had dismissed 2 years ago. He read Sira Kohn's original warning about the navigation network. He read Tor Vashai's reconnaissance report. He read the intelligence assessments that his own advisors had buried because they did not want to deliver bad news. He read them all, and he understood with a clarity that came too late that the quiet margin had never been quiet. It had been the foundation, and he had let it walk away. Sira Kohn had spent the past year doing what she did best, working patiently behind the scenes. She met with delegates from 12 species in private. She shared data. She made arguments. She built a coalition of moderates who understood that the Council's survival depended on something it had never been good at, admitting it was wrong. When Sira finally brought her proposal to the chamber floor, she did not dress it in diplomatic language. She stood in the center of the amphitheater and said plainly that the Council needed to contact humanity. Not as a superior body summoning a lesser species. Not as an authority demanding compliance. As equals, requesting a conversation. The chamber erupted. Some delegates called it an insult to the Council's dignity. Others argued that reaching out would make them look weak. Dren Okari's representative said the Dominion would handle the human problem through military means if necessary. Sira waited for the noise to die down, and then asked Dren's representative exactly how he planned to send a military fleet through a boundary that had already swallowed 2 warships without leaving a scratch. The room went quiet. The vote was close. It passed by a margin of 7. Vurun Thes did not vote for or against it. He simply sat in his chair and said nothing, and his silence was the loudest thing in the room. A single diplomatic vessel was prepared. It was small and unarmed, a gesture of peaceful intent that also reflected the reality that the Council could not spare anything larger from its stretched military. Sira Kohn insisted on leading the delegation herself. She brought with her 3 junior diplomats and a communications officer. No guards, no weapons, no backup plan. The ship traveled to the last known coordinates of the Veil Line and stopped. Sira ordered the communications officer to broadcast an open signal on every frequency. A simple message, identifying themselves as a Council delegation, requesting dialogue with representatives of the Terran people. Then they waited. The first day passed in silence. The veil hung before them like a curtain of nothing, featureless and unreadable. The junior diplomats grew nervous. Sira told them to be patient. She said humanity had waited 60 years for the Council to treat them with respect. A few days of waiting was the least the Council owed them. The second day passed. The communications officer reported no response on any channel. The ship sat alone in empty space, its running lights the only point of brightness for light years in any direction. On the third night, Sira was sitting in her quarters, reviewing her notes, when the ship trembled slightly. She went to the command deck and looked at the forward display. The veil was changing. A section of the boundary directly ahead of them was thinning, peeling apart like fog in morning sunlight. A corridor of clear space opened before them, stretching inward toward a point of light in the far distance. At the end of the corridor, a ship appeared, then two more flanking it, then a dozen more behind those. The steadfast horizon sat at the center of the formation, larger than any vessel Sira had ever seen up close, its hull lines clean and unfamiliar, radiating energy signatures that her ship's sensors could not classify. The escort ships around it were sleek and fast-looking, built for a kind of speed and agility that the Council's engineers had never achieved. Sira stared at the formation for a long moment. Then she told her pilot to proceed slowly into the corridor. They docked with the steadfast horizon 20 minutes later. Lieutenant Megan Cole met them at the airlock. She was polite, but not warm. She shook Sira's hand, welcomed her aboard in a tone that was professional and nothing more, and escorted the delegation through corridors that were bright, clean, and humming with quiet power. Sira noticed that every human they passed stood straight and moved with purpose. There was no arrogance in it. There was something harder to dismiss. There was confidence, the kind that came from knowing exactly what they had built and exactly what it was worth. The meeting chamber was a simple room with a long table and a window that looked out into the corridor of open space, where Sira's ship still sat like a small bird, resting in the palm of a giant hand. Commander Danny Holt sat at one end of the table. Ambassador Kevin Price sat beside him. Kevin looked the same as he had 2 years ago, calm, patient, with his hands folded in front of him. But something in his eyes was different. The weariness was gone. In its place was a steadiness that Sira recognized, because she had seen it in people who had finally found the ground they were meant to stand on. Sira sat down across from them. She took a breath and began. She told them that the Council recognized the significance of humanity's departure. She told them that the Council wished to discuss terms for renewed relations. She chose her words with care, avoiding anything that sounded like a command or a demand. She was asking, and everyone in the room knew it. Kevin Price looked at her for a long time when she finished. He did not rush to respond. He sat with her words the way he had once sat with every dismissal and every ignored proposal, giving them the full weight of his attention. Then he spoke. He told her that humanity was not returning to the Galactic Council. Not now, and perhaps not ever. The Council as it existed was built on a hierarchy that placed some species above others, and humanity had spent 60 years at the bottom of that hierarchy, learning exactly what that structure produced. It produced arrogance at the top and silence at the bottom, and neither of those things built anything worth keeping. But, he continued, humanity was not interested in isolation either. They had not left the galaxy to hide from it. They had left to build something that proved a different kind of relationship was possible. And now they were willing to share that proof. He slid a document across the table. It was not a treaty. It was not a list of demands. It was an invitation. It proposed a new framework for interspecies relations built on 3 principles: mutual respect between all parties, regardless of age or power, equal standing in all decisions that affected shared space, and the recognition that no species was too small to matter, and none was too large to be held accountable for its actions. The document did not mention reparations. It did not mention punishment. It did not mention the 60 years of insults, the ignored proposals, the phrase, the quiet margin. It simply offered a path forward and left the choice to the Council. Sira read the document carefully, page by page. When she finished, she looked up at Kevin Price. She looked at Danny Holt, who stood by the viewport, watching the Council ship sitting in the corridor of light. She looked at Megan Cole, who leaned against the wall near the door, with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Then, for the first time in this story, Sierra Cone smiled. It was small and tired, and carried the weight of everything she had tried to say for 2 years while no one listened. But it was real. She told Kevin that she could not speak for the entire council. She told him that there were members who would reject this invitation out of pride, and others who would reject it out of fear. But she told him that she would carry it back and she would fight for it, because it was the first thing she had read in her entire career that sounded like the galaxy she had always wanted to live in. He did not smile, but his eyes softened in a way that said more than any expression could. Danny Holt stood at the viewport and watched as the council ship eventually undocked and began its slow journey back through the corridor toward open space. Behind it, the Veil Line held steady, an open door waiting to see what the galaxy would choose to do next. He thought about the years of silence. He thought about Kevin sitting in that amphitheater with his hands folded while the galaxy laughed. He thought about Laura Bishop moving 9 billion people through the dark without a sound. He thought about Penny Marsh in her basement, solving problems the galaxy said could not be solved. He thought about Megan pulling stations apart, and Nate watching from the shadows, and every single human being who had carried the quiet weight of being dismissed, and had turned it into something extraordinary. The loudest thing humanity had ever done was leave without saying a word. And now, standing on the other side of that silence, they had something no amount of shouting could have given them. They had the power to choose what came next. On the pale morning, still holding position at the edge of the Veil Line, Captain Laura Bishop opened her ship's log and wrote the final entry for the day. She kept it short, because she had always believed that the best words were the ones that did not waste your time. She wrote that they believed silence meant surrender. She wrote that they never considered that it might mean we were already gone and already ahead. Then she closed the log, dimmed her console light, and watched the stars. The great amphitheater on Aethys Prime was never quiet. Hundreds of species filled its curved rows every session cycle, their voices rising and falling like ocean tides, echoing off walls made from polished stone older than most civilizations in the room. Translators hummed in every ear. Lights shifted color depending on which delegate held the speaking floor. The air itself carried the weight of importance, of decisions that shaped the lives of trillions across the galaxy. But on this particular morning, Delegate Sierra Cone of the Valesi noticed something that no one else seemed to care about. She leaned forward in her seat and looked across the amphitheater toward the far left section, the one tucked near the back wall where the lighting was slightly dimmer than the rest. The human section. It was empty. Not just 1 or 2 seats missing their occupants. Every single chair was unoccupied. The small console screens at each desk were dark. The nameplate at the front of the section still read Terran Delegation, but there was a thin layer of dust on it that Sierra could see even from her distance. She checked her records. This was the 3rd consecutive council session without any human presence. No formal notice of absence had been submitted. No message. No protest filed. Nothing at all. Sierra looked around the chamber to see if anyone else had noticed. No one had. The session continued as though the empty section did not exist, which, she realized with a slow chill down her spine, was exactly how the council had always treated it. 6 months earlier, Ambassador Kevin Price had sat in that very section. He was a calm man, not tall, not loud, with thinning brown hair and a way of folding his hands on the desk in front of him that made him look like he was always waiting for something. He had been Earth's representative to the Galactic Council for 9 years, and in those 9 years, he had submitted 47 formal proposals. Trade route access, colonial boundary definitions, resource sharing agreements, scientific exchange programs. 47 proposals, each written with care, each backed by data, each submitted through proper channels. Not a single one had ever reached the debate floor. The council had a process for reviewing proposals from provisional members, and humanity had been provisional since the day it was admitted, 60 years ago. Provisional meant they could attend sessions but not vote. They could submit proposals, but could not demand they be heard. They could speak during open comment periods, but only after every full member had finished, which usually meant the session was already ending. Kevin sat through the morning session and listened as High Arbiter Vorun Fess, the ancient Tisari, who had led the council for longer than humanity had been a spacefaring species, casually referred to the region of space where human colonies existed. He called it the quiet margin. It was a phrase the council used for territory it considered too unimportant to govern, too far from anything that mattered to be worth attention. The delegates around the chamber nodded, as though this was simply a fact of geography and not an insult wrapped in politeness. Kevin said nothing. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave them satisfaction. He sat with his hands folded, his face still, and he waited for the session to end. Afterward, he walked through the long corridors of the embassy district on Aethys Prime. The human wing was modest compared to the sprawling complexes of the Tisari or the fortified towers of the Rokon Dominion. It had 12 rooms, a small communications office, and a kitchen that Kevin mostly used to make coffee, which no other species in the galaxy seemed to understand or appreciate. He walked into the main meeting room and found Commander Danny Holt sitting at the table. Danny was not supposed to be on Aethys Prime. His official record showed that he was overseeing a supply rotation at a logistics depot 3 systems away. He was a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and steady dark eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong time. He wore a plain gray jacket with no rank insignia, which was itself a message. Whatever he was here for, it was not official. Or rather, it was so official that it could not afford to look like it. Kevin sat down across from him. Danny placed a sealed data tablet on the table between them, and said nothing for a moment. Then he told Kevin that what was on the tablet had been in preparation for over 10 years. It came directly from Earth's Unified Command, signed by every branch chief, and approved at the highest civilian level. It was not a suggestion, it was an order. Kevin opened the tablet and read. The document was not long. It did not use dramatic language. It did not reference the decades of insults, the dismissed proposals, the way humanity had been treated like a stray animal, allowed to sleep near the fire, but never welcomed inside. It simply laid out a plan, step by step, clear and calm. Humanity was leaving the Galactic Council, not with a declaration, not with a speech, not with anger or threats, or any of the things the Council might have expected from a young, emotional species. They were simply going to stop. Stop attending sessions. Stop responding to communications. Stop maintaining their embassies, their outposts, their relay stations in Council-monitored space. Every human asset, every citizen, every piece of technology would be quietly relocated behind a boundary that the Council did not know existed. Kevin read the plan twice. Then he looked at Danny and asked the question that mattered most. Would the Council try to stop them? Danny leaned back in his chair. He told Kevin that the Council would not stop them because the Council would not notice, not for a long time. Humanity had spent 60 years being invisible in that amphitheater. Now they were going to use that invisibility for something the Council never imagined. They were going to disappear, and they were going to do it so gently that by the time anyone thought to look for them, there would be nothing left to find. Kevin sat with that for a while. He thought about the 47 proposals. He thought about the phrase, the quiet margin. He thought about every session where he had folded his hands and waited and been passed over as though he were furniture. Then he stood up. He picked up his diplomatic seal from the desk where it had sat for 9 years. A small metal disc engraved with Earth's emblem and his name. He placed it flat on the table. Not in a drawer, not in a case, just flat on the surface, face up, like a coin left behind after a meal. He told Danny he was ready. They walked out of the embassy together. Kevin did not look back. Behind them, the lights in the human wing powered down one by one, following the automated shutdown sequence that had been programmed weeks in advance. The door sealed itself. The corridor went dark. No note was left. No message was pinned to the board. No forwarding address was filed with the station registry. The human embassy on Aethys Prime simply went quiet, and the galaxy continued on without giving it a second thought. That was exactly what Danny was counting on. Silence, after all, was something the Council had taught humanity very well. They had just never considered that one day humanity might use it back.